Episode 7, AD 754 to 840. What happens when a society, one anciently established, of great cultural density and possessed of a high civilized tradition, what happens when it slips and gradually glides onto a lower flight path? And what then if out of the blue it is struck by an enormous exterior blow? For this is what happened to the Romano-Christian Mediterranean world. The slippage occurred sometime in the mid-500s. In 550 AD, Constantinople had a population of 375,000, an enormous city for that time. The population of Alexandria is estimated to have been 250,000, 250,000 people. In the previous century, Rome had been much bigger again, with a population of about 500,000. But Justinian's disastrously destructive war to reconquer Italy had brought about its reduction. By the mid-600s, it had declined to a tenth of that figure, to a mere 50,000 people. Nevertheless, the ancient world continued to stand, well into what we call the Dark Ages, and to function as it always had. The state grain shipments from Carthage to Rome, the annone supporting the poor among the huge population, did not fully cease to be shipped from Africa until the late 500s, while the annone from Alexandria, shipped from Egypt to Constantinople, ceased only with the Sassanid and Muslim conquests from 618 onwards. However destructive it had been, the Justinian reconquest of the mid-500s had brought much of Italy quickly back into the long-range trade and communications networks of the Roman Empire, as is shown by the remains of goods and amphorae found at Milan and Ravenna. Shipwreck data from the 500s show the continued maritime and trading activity across the whole Mediterranean, much as before. Genoa and Frankish Marseille were integral and active nodes within this network. Although in Italy, the archaeological evidence shows that there was little trade across the boundaries between Lombard-held territories and those still under Roman sovereignty, the overall picture of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean through the 500s is one of social infrastructures and networks remaining intact and functioning, and of life going on very much as before. But calamities were bringing about a degree of slippage. The Mediterranean underwent a major and prolonged outbreak of the bubonic plague, beginning in 541 and recurring until its last vicious bout at Constantinople in 750, that is, lasting for over 2 centuries. Loss of provinces to immigrating barbarians and the decimation of the urban centres by plague undermined and were enfeebling the Roman Empire. Although it was a world that was still largely intact, interconnected and functioning, it was doing so on a less prosperous and vigorous level. It had entered onto the lower glide path mentioned previously. In a gradual social process, the civilizational grandeur of previous ages diminished, already in the late 500s. Cities everywhere in Syria, Africa, Asia Minor and Europe began to exhibit the same transformation. The Christian basilica and other churches were the new and the only substantial public edifices built. The streets became narrower as houses were extended and divided up. The public spaces were encroached upon by private structures. There is a clear shrinkage of the scale and opulence of what new baths were being constructed in Syria and Egypt. These now smaller complexes were the Roman baths taken over and culturally absorbed by the invading Arabs, we call them Turkish baths, of the Islamic world down to this day. The audience for high culture shrank considerably. Outside the imperial capital, the portion of the well-to-do who read books and kept home libraries declined to nearly nil. The prestige of the classical cultural tradition was waning. Back in the days of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, in about 170 AD, the emperor wrote 3 letters a day to the sophist intellectual Herodes Atticus, and he delayed his journey for days at Smyrna for the privilege of meeting another famous man of letters, alias Aristides. And now in our period, in 600 AD, Emperor Heraclius continued to pay the salary of his court panegyrist and poet. Higher education was still available at Constantinople, where Stephen of Alexandria taught philosophy and medicine, perhaps occupying a publicly funded professorial chair. But as one historian put it, quote, "The decline in education acquired its own momentum, diminishing with each generation the number who could appreciate the effects of schooling on a man's writing, speeches, or performance in office." End quote. This shrinkage, compounded by the perennial theological struggles that went on, has appeared to modern historians as almost a preparation for the calamity of the Islamic invasions. And there is no shortage of such writers who evaluate the spectacular success of the Arab conquest as the just deserts of a so-called decadent Roman world ripe to be overthrown. We have already seen the unfolding of those invasions out of Arabia in the previous episodes. We turn now to their effects. One scholar of the period put it thus, quote, "The main reason for Byzantium's, that is the Roman Empire's, decreasing wealth and population was, of course, conquest by the empire's enemies." End quote. The loss of Armenia, of Italy, and the Balkans were probably not grave, since they had also cost much to defend. But the loss of Syria, Egypt, and Africa were a true catastrophe. He points out that between 610 and 780, the Roman Empire lost 2/3 of its territory, half of its population, and a similar proportion of its productive capacity. Quote, "If the empire had about 17 million people under Phocas in 610 AD, it probably had some 7 million under Leo IV in 760 AD, with almost the entire decrease attributable to conquest by the enemy." End quote. The revenue of the Emperor Justinian in the 530s had been 8.5 million numismata. Under Emperor Constantine V in the 750s, this had shrunk to 2 million numismata, less than a quarter. The Arabs estimated that Egypt at that date was to them worth 2 million numismata. The other lost provinces, including Syria, would have yielded another 2 million. When Africa went in 698, it meant a loss of about 1 million numismata to the treasury, about a quarter of the empire's remaining revenue. Most cities in the empire had been sacked at least once by the Sassanids, then the Arabs, or in Thrace and Greece also by the Avars. Many had been hit by the plague and some had suffered earthquakes. But the key factor was that these losses to infrastructure and physical building stock were not repaired. All available resources in the cities went into strengthening fortifications, which were always of an ad hoc kind and using the very materials of the city itself, including column drums and even statues, to build up the walls. Once substantial cities shrank to just the size of mere towns, huddled beneath the reinforced or new citadels. Constantinople had had a population of 375,000 in 540, as we said, but by 740, in the century following the Islamic invasions, it had shrunk to less than 100,000. Trade declined, as evidenced by the substantial decrease in the coin that survives from this period. Gold nomisma do survive, but these were used for long-distance trade with the Caliphate. But the copper coinage used in everyday exchange decreased enormously. The society in many areas reverted to a largely barter and self-sufficient, ruralized economy. By 780, the empire and the caliphate were separated not by stable and mutually recognized frontiers, but by a shifting, depopulated no man's land, which included nearly the whole of the barren region between the Anti-Taurus Mountains and the Taurus. Thread Gold reminds us that, quote, "Just inside the Cilician gates through the Taurus Mountains, Arab raids could be an annual occurrence, and led the hapless inhabitants to dig themselves underground shelters in the soft rock." End quote. Within the remaining empire, lots of people were dispossessed refugees. Razzias, plagues, and disasters had destroyed many old family fortunes and made a few new ones. The emperors purged the civil administration and the church several times, thereby greatly depleting the ranks of the professional and educated layers of society. Quote, records of every sort came to be kept less well, and traditions of many sorts broke down. End quote. As the interests of the leading provincials shifted from city to country and from the administration to the army, their ideals became those of military distinction rather than civic and cultural prominence, and their sons ceased to need anything more than an elementary education. In 726, Emperor Leo III lamented that many officials were unable to understand the existing law books. A Greek translation from the original Latin was made of Justinian's great Codex of Roman law, but this was a much diminished tome called the Ecloga. What did the emperor expect? The law school at Constantinople had already closed down. The iconoclast emperors exiled and isolated the fragile remains of the literate coteries that remained in church and society. In 692, the Quinisext Church Council had to inveigh against people in Constantinople who were cutting up biblical and patristic manuscripts, who threw them away or even boiled them down to make perfume. The iconoclast movement did much to engender an atmosphere of culture-destroying indifference towards manuscripts as it did towards images. But despite a clear regression in education and literary and technical skills, the Roman Empire's Dark Age was not wholly devastating. Most old manuscripts were preserved in the libraries of Constantinople, which continued to possess almost every literary work that had been known in the 6th century, the loss of the Great Library at Alexandria notwithstanding. Secular officials and clergymen still received at least a mediocre education. A select few went on to become well educated, as prominent figures in the following generation were to show. Indicative of the impact on society of the great calamity of the 600s was that the main fresh water supply to the imperial city of Constantinople, the aqueduct of Valens, which had been cut and partially destroyed by the besieging Avars in 626, was not repaired until the reign of Emperor Constantine V in 767. In other words, it was inoperative for a period of 141 years. But Constantinople, and with it a part of what had been the Roman Empire, did not fall, as the Sassanid Empire had completely and utterly fallen in 644 AD. The Romans slowed the Muslims down. Constantinople withstood two determined sieges in 678 and 714. The razzias across Asia Minor were repeated and sometimes struck very deep, and were always destructive and calamitous for the people living in the war zone. But it was a small wonder that the emperors, of this their most dire and darkest hour, found the means to rally and to resist. They did so by taking radical steps. Military pay was drastically cut to just a quarter of what it had been before 616. 1 annona of 5 numismata for each soldier instead of 4 annonae, totaling 20 numismata. Between 659 and 662, the imperial estates, the fiscus, were liquidated in order to give land grants to supplement the soldiers' pay, now at a subsistence level. In this way, what was called the system of the themes re-established something like the archaic Roman or cincinnatus model, where the soldiers returned to being full-time farmers living on their land with their families and dependents, and who served regular shifts under arms, and served in emergencies and on short, if major, expeditions. The cavalry were endowed with sufficiently large estates to support an extensive network of family and slaves, enough to provide sustenance and support for an officer's full-time specialism as a horse soldier away on duty. The themes defended the empire well. From the time of their creation around 660, they greatly slowed and in the end stopped the catastrophic losses of land and men of the previous half-century. The elite of the army, the imperial praesentales, those present with the emperor, and the mobile field regiments, the tagmata, were concentrated in what were now the home provinces of Opsicion and Thracia, on either side of the Dardanelles. These provinces, together with the cities of the coast and the Aegean islands, were now the centres of population and economic activity and of agricultural production. Out in the danger zones of inland Asia Minor, the farms of the thematic frontier regiments lay scattered around the provincial capital, which now resembled more a major defensive citadel than a civic community. The Roman Empire had survived, just. The consequences of the Islamic invasions were a less monetized economy, less trade, and a less urbanized and much more militarized society. The imperial government, and Greco-Roman society at large, devoted a much bigger share of its now much smaller resources to the army, leaving much less for other purposes, such as great buildings, artistic patronage, educational foundations, and social welfare, which had been such marked features of the Roman state in its glory days. These were now gone, but Constantinople had survived the catastrophe. Pirenne has shown us that the period in Gaul called Merovingian, the period between 500 and 750, that in this period the Roman way of life continued on its usual paths, supported and nourished by the long-distance trade and cultural contacts between the royal Frankish city of Marseille and the ports of the Eastern Roman Empire. That is, Rome itself, then Syracuse, Carthage, Alexandria, Levantine Syria, and above all, Constantinople itself. The evidence he advanced in 1937 was that the basic infrastructure and networks of the Roman world remained more or less intact throughout this time. Papyrus, which was made only at Alexandria, was used in the monasteries and at the Curia Regis, the royal court chancery, and spices, which were also only available from the eastern Mediterranean, served as condiments to the food of the Frankish nobility and the clergy. Here is a list from a donation made from the Celarium Fisci, the fiscal cellars at Foss, made to the Abbey of Corbie by King Chilpericus II. There were substantial colonies of Syrians, Greeks, and of Jews established and living in the cities of Merovingian Gaul as there were in Spain and Italy. These were the negociatores, genere Syrus, merchants of the Syrian kind, who had their own quarters in the cities like Ravenna, Bordeaux, Paris, and many others. They financed their long-distance commerce with gold coinage, still struck with imperial-type images throughout the period. They advanced loans at interest and held stocks in warehouses and employed a literate staff. Many of them were extremely rich as a result and moved in the inner circle of the Merovingian kings. Indicative of the realities of this world is also a letter from Pope Gregory the Great, dated 597, to the Patriarch, his colleague at Alexandria, concerning a famous wine produced there, the Cognidium. This reflects the interconnectedness and relative ease of commercial intercourse still prevalent throughout the Mediterranean in the very late 500s AD. Pirenne shows us how all this changed drastically and did so quite suddenly. The last document relating to the royal entrepôt at Marseille dates from 716. In 720, the Muslims based now at Narbonne had sacked it thoroughly and rendered it dead as a commercial port. Gold coins ceased to be minted after about 750. It was no longer needed. Long-distance trade had been rendered impossible by the fact that the Western Mediterranean and its coastal cities were now a hunting ground for Muslim raiders. We read of no further mention of Syrian negociatores. As a class and an economic function, they ceased to exist. Papyrus ceased to be used in the Merovingian chancellery as elsewhere after 677. Then the much more expensive and difficult to prepare parchment began to be used, necessarily more sparingly. A picture emerges then that between 650 and 750, the whole Roman world suffered not only the loss of much of its heart and core, but also underwent processes of the most severe economic, social and cultural setback, all the direct result of the Islamic invasions. These features described above were the concrete realities of the onset of a real Dark Age in what remained of the Greco-Roman world. The chronicler of the Doctrina Jacobi, probably written in Palestine around 634, recounts how Abraham, a Jew from Palestine, writes a letter. Quote, "They say that a prophet has appeared among the Saracens and is proclaiming the advent of the Anointed One who is to come. I, Abraham, went off to Sycamina and referred the matter to an old man, very well versed in the Scriptures. I asked him, 'What is your view, master and teacher, of the prophet who has appeared among the Saracens?' He replied, groaning mightily, 'He is an impostor. Do the prophets come with the sword and chariot? Truly these happenings are the works of disorder. But go you off, Master Abraham, and find out about the prophet who has appeared.' So I, Abraham, made inquiries and was told by those who had met him, 'There is no truth to be found in the so-called prophet, only bloodshed. For he says he has the keys of paradise, which is incredible.'" End quote. The Doctrina Jacobi gives us one of the very rare glimpses of how people at the time of the Islamic conquests thought about what was happening around them. The clear perception was that this new prophet was a warrior who brought the sword. Indeed, within the new and almost entirely lost early historiography of Islam, the deeds of the prophet were studied for the first 200 years under the title of the Ilm al-Maghazi, the prophet's campaigns, that is, his military exploits. In the eyes of the original tribesmen of the Futu, of the conquest, there was no unease at all that their high religious authority, God's direct messenger, should be above all a great warrior and leader of warriors. It was nothing other than what they expected. In the last episode, we have seen how these, the original tribesmen, were subordinated, and then in the course of several internecine conflicts that permanently split the Muslim community, they were rendered subject to the caliphs, now ruling their vast empire, no longer from their native Medina, but from Damascus, in the land of the conquered. For as Abu Hamza al-Karaji said at the time, quote, "The land is our land, the property is our property, the people are our slaves," end quote. The original religious history of Islam is utterly irretrievable. So buried is it under the edifice of what is called the Islamic tradition. Historian Patricia Crone concludes her assessment of the sources by stating, quote, "The religious tradition of Islam is thus a monument to the destruction rather than the preservation of the past, which affects the entire account of the religious evolution of Islam until the second half of the Umayyad period." End quote. The truth, perhaps buried within the tribal historical sources, is almost as irretrievable and impenetrable as the religious record. Quote, "The Muslim canon of tribal history consisted of an invariable canon formed between 150 and 200 years after the Prophet's death. It is for that reason that it is so extraordinarily impenetrable." End quote. What we have then is a faint residue, perhaps peeking out from beneath the polemically motivated accounts put in place by the religious lawyers of the Abbasid period 200 years after the events, and is now known as the so-called classical tradition of Islamic historiography. Professor Crone says something that I find to be remarkable and true. Quote, "Whoever comes from studying the Mediterranean world of late antiquity to that of the Arab conquerors must be struck by the apparently total lack of continuity. The Syria to which Heraclius bade his moving farewell seems to have vanished from the face of the earth. Nothing in the Arab accounts of the conquest betrays the fact that the Arabs had crossed into the colourful world described by historians of late antiquity. In the east, the Arabs saw Kisras and Marjubans. In the west, Khazars and Bactrics. But whatever else they saw, they took no notice. The Syrian pillar saints dispensing grace to local Arab tribesmen, the Coptic peasants, riotous Alexandrines, or sophisticated Nestorians at home in the King of Kings' court, all these had been conjured away at a stroke. End quote. The complete caesura that one finds between the reality that had been the world of late antiquity and the world of Islam, which overwhelmed it, reflects the immense mental chasm between the society of the conquered indigenes and the incomers who now ruled over them. During the Sufyanid period, 661 to 684, the Caliph bestowed enormous powers and almost complete autonomy on a tiny group of provincial governors, as we call them. They in turn chose from their kin sub-governors. All these were chosen on the basis of their standing as chiefs of their tribes. These governors held enormous powers of command over revenues. They were supposed to subtract their province's expenses and forward the bulk onto Damascus. Of course they didn't. The sum forwarded became fixed as the Kabbalah, and the governors kept the unlimited remainder for themselves and their clients. The sums involved were enormous. Yazid I bestowed gifts of largesse on a delegation of tribal leaders from Medina in the range of 100,000 dirhams each. Abd al-Rahman admitted that as governor of Khurasan he had made a personal profit of 20 million dirhams. The Marwanid system, which followed between 684 and 744, saw the gradual replacement of the tribal chiefs by what we call generals, as the military commanders, based on their effectiveness and their ability to ensure the loyalty of their now much more diverse formations, took over. The bringing of non-Arab recruits, often as whole detachments, into the army occurred initially on the frontiers in places like Khorasan in the east and in Ifriqiya in the west, but it spread back into the heartlands of the conquest. With time, this eroded the original Arabian tribal composition and character of the conquest's forces of occupation. The generals adopted the titles of the chieftains and their detachments the names of the tribal conglomerations they had grown up within. While this remained their political identity vocabulary, in reality these were men serving for pay as professional soldiers, not a community in arms as the tribes had been. At this stage, some of the tribesmen began to become civilians with families and worked as merchants, the owners of craft workshops, owners of caravans, etc. This was the beginning of the integration of the Arabians into the societies they had once conquered, and the end of their exclusive ghettos of occupation. They became city dwellers and the subjects of the, to them alien, provincial generals. It was these ex-tribal settlers in the cities that were to be the authors of what we know today as Sharia law. Competition among sub-generals for the top job and among the general governors for the caliphate itself led to military politics, factional alignments of parts of the army using tribal names to identify themselves and sloganize. As the governor increasingly relied on his own military clientele, the appointment of a top governor was the appointment of a faction whose members, from the lowest subordinate at the bottom to the figurehead at the top, all diverted part of the revenues into their own pockets. Dismissal of a sub-governor accordingly meant the dismissal of his faction. The rival faction had few inhibitions regarding the fallen party. The larger the amount of money that had been embezzled, the harsher the treatment that was meted out. Failure to pay up was met by imprisonment and torture, often resulting in the death of the victim. Willingness to pay was also dangerous, since it encouraged a belief that there was more to be had. Hence, governors were not so much dismissed as suddenly seized and thrown into jail. The replacement of a governor was planned in greatest secrecy because of fears of revolt in the event of a leak. In 738, Khalid al-Khazri, when he got wind that he was about to be dismissed, paid up 9 million dirhams, which only prompted his replacement, Yusuf, to dream of a total of 100 million dirhams, which he could extract. The great Hajjaj, in power, had demanded 6 million dirhams when he deposed Yazid. Hajjaj himself fell in 714, betrayed by his fiscal agent Salih, who was allowed to do what he liked with Hajjaj's family, whom he tortured. The winner in the faction wars eventually was Yazid III, who led the Iraq-based Yamanid faction. These sneaked into Damascus and seized Caliph Walid, whom they then murdered in the name of religious righteousness and social justice, along with many of his family. It should be noted that the overwhelming majority of converts to Islam during this period were prisoners of war who had been enslaved and later in their lives freed. The number of prisoners of war which the Arabs took in the course of their conquest was staggering, and enslavement hit all social, ethnic and religious groups in the Middle East. Dispersed among the conquerors and employed for the most part as domestic servants, these slaves rapidly adopted the norms and values of their masters, while at the same time they and their descendants continued to be despised by their masters' society. These ex-slaves supplied a disproportionate number of the scholars, scribes, tutors and poets to the late Umayyad and the early Abbasid courts. Large-scale enslavement continued to act as a powerful, assimilating institution of the Muslim world for many centuries. With time, a parallel mechanism also came to the fore. The exaction of the jizya and other taxes from the peasantry of the ex-Sassanid and Roman territories was so ruthless that waves of the rural poor simply fled. They fled to the cities, which is where Islamic power had its seat. Some gained protected positions by converting and making themselves useful. The great majority of these Christian and Zoroastrian fugitives, however, found the only way they could become tax immune and live was to become convert soldiers, and they did so in droves. In 696, Bukhari ibn Wisha was told that he only needed to promise to forgive the taxes of converts to Islam in order to summon up an army of superbly obedient fighters. And this is precisely what the governor of Egypt did, Hafs ibn al-Walid, to raise an army for himself of 20,000 Christian renegades, according to a Christian source. With the Abbasid faction's seizure of power in 750, the rationale for keeping the capital of the caliphate in Damascus had evaporated. The preponderance of the most powerful tribes there had ceased to matter. The caliphate was now a business of the generals, among whom the Abbasids were the victors. They immediately moved the capital to the political center of the new realities of power, to Baghdad in the middle of Iraq. The Abbasids elevated a group officially known as the Mawali, people whose parents had converted and were the personal clients of the caliph himself. These worked as domestics in the postal service and in the administration and in the massive internal spy system. At the court in Baghdad, the sons of those who had rallied to the Abbasids in the civil war became bureaucrats and soldiers. This is the milieu at court which patronized the Christian scholars, Nestorians, who were commissioned to translate the Greek classical texts which they had kept in their possession for the 3 or 4 intervening centuries. Others among this new ruling elite became the opponents of this court culture which fostered the translations, becoming champions of the religious reaction against it. The most famous to us of these Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad was Harun al-Rashid, 766 to 809. The wealth flowing into Baghdad at this time had reached phenomenal proportions, but to the effect that there were revolts among the Christian populace in both Egypt and Lebanon, spurred by a taxation system ruthlessly enforced by the Baghdad bureaucracy. There were also revolts all over the caliphate. Harun allowed the sole survivor of the massacre of the Umayyad family, Abd al-Rahman, to retain power in his now independent emirate of Spain. He acted with similar indifference when Morocco drifted away. He sold Ifriqiya to the son of a Khurashani soldier. Viewed from deep inside Iraq, these provinces possibly appear to him to be marginal to what really mattered. Caliph Harun recruited Mawali soldiers, that is, non-Arabs, on a mass scale. 500,000 Iranians became his personal clients, to be used to enforce his power over all other sections of society. They were dubbed the Abbasiyya, and 20,000 of them were transferred to Baghdad. This was the beginning of a political strategy that was soon to culminate in an institution unique to Islamic civilization, of entire armies being composed of slaves, bought from beyond the frontiers, and utterly dependent on the caliph, and used to keep the rest of society in a state of political passivity. It was against this background of a world transformed, and under the shadow of a far greater power, encroaching from the southeast and by sea, that the emperors in Constantinople struggled to build the system of the Themes to fend off the chronic raids and wars launched against them. They were severely handicapped in facing the Arabs in Anatolia by the emergence of a new tribal formation from the steppes around the Caspian Sea, the Bulgars, who had replaced the Avars and advanced across the open Danube frontier to take northern Thrace. In 811, things went so far as Emperor Nicephorus I being killed in battle against the formidable Tsar of the Bulgars, Krum I, who famously, in the tradition of the Scythian steppe, used the emperor's skull as a banqueting chalice. Nevertheless, during these long decades, from about 718 to the mid-9th century, what remained of the Roman Empire managed to protect its core territories from attacks on both sides of the Dardanelles and to stabilize itself. Meanwhile, far off in the Occident, another form of stability was being reached, thanks to the gathering of loyalties among the nobilities of Gaul and across the Rhine around the militarily prestigious Pepinids, or the House of Herstal, known to us by the Christian name of their greatest scion, the Carolingians. And as we have seen in episode 6, the papacy had taken the initiative to bring about an unprecedented symbiosis between Roman Italy and this new and dynamic Frankish power. These two centers of the West, the one exercising potestas, power, and the other embodying auctoritas, authority, neared one another and, suddenly, like two pools of mercury, jumped to form a unitary entity. This symbiotic juncture engendered the Occident as a self-sufficient religio-political phenomenon and laid the foundations for a specifically European civilization. The popes had bestowed not only sacral legitimacy upon the House of Herstal as the new Stirps Regia, the sacred line of kings, but also bestowed a mantle of religious and cultural respectability upon a region which, until this point in the mid-700s, had been a backwater. The Franks, from the time of Clodovecus or Clovis in 500 AD, had been largely embroiled in their own internal dynastic affairs, in subduing the separate kingdoms of Gaul, as well as the stem duchies across the Rhine. In the great affairs of the Mediterranean world, to which they were economically connected through Marseille, they had been absent or inert. Eventually, the Mediterranean, in the form of the Muslim Near East, came to them instead, and penetrated as far north as Tours. As a result of their victory there, their outlook on the world changed. They were now capable of, as we say, projecting power. And as a part of this civilization-forming realignment, the Occidental Church too was in the process of undergoing a major transformation. In the 730s and 740s, the English monk Bonifacius worked indefatigably in Thuringia, Bavaria and Frisia, founding monastic settlements including what would become the monastery of Fulda in 744. In 751, it was officially recognized by Pope Zacharias, not as under a local bishopric, but directly under the authority of the Bishop of Rome. In these efforts in the heartlands of pagan Germania, he was actively supported by the papacy, which gave him legitimacy, assistance, and the pallium of a bishop, and by the Pippinid dynasty of Francia, which provided both resources and troops to protect him. This joining of missionary activity to power had many features of being a new model of Christianity. Christendom had remained, since the time of Constantine the Great, the religion of the Romans and of those who wanted to be like them. There were exceptions, like the Nestorians in Persia and Patrick in Ireland, but generally the boundaries of Christendom had always corresponded with those of the Roman Empire. And like the Roman Empire, Christianity was massively stable, inward-looking, and somewhat inert. Its waves of monastic travelling preachers and monastery founders, such as the Irish monks of the 600s, had been internal reformers, not external missionaries. Bonifacius and his Anglo-Saxon monks brought with them from their distant island a new spirit and outlook. Their success in pagan Germania, their little clearings by a river with a wooden stockade, and within it a wooden church, dormitories, farm buildings, etc., signify the initiation of a dynamic, expansive Christian mission to convert the pagans. It also signified a grand project to extend Christendom beyond its customary Roman boundaries, in a potentially infinitely extendable missionary drive. The relics of the martyrs and saints were deliberately brought from Rome, across the Danube and the Rhine, into darkest Germania, where once the legionary standards had been advanced, and then withdrawn. This time there was to be no retreat. Western Latin Christianity was beginning to expand into Central Europe. It was an audacious and a dangerous program, guaranteed to provoke a violent reaction by the German tribes. These vulnerable little monasteries, with perhaps a dozen monks, would implement the by then established Roman Christian doctrine that a Christian should not be a slave of a pagan, nor of a Jew or a Saracen. This was the seed from which Christianity's eventual opposition to slavery was to grow many centuries later. Slaves and bondsmen belonging to the tribal aristocracy would flee and seek refuge in the monasteries. There they would convert to Christianity and become the initial local congregation. Their owners would turn up and demand their property back, which would be refused. The monastery would be burned and the monks slain. The response back in the royal villas in Austrasia and Neustria would be the mounting of a Frankish punitive expedition into Thuringia, Frisia, or later into Saxony, wreaking slaughter and havoc upon the tribesmen and their villages. The subjugated tribespeople would be invited or compelled to be baptized. Baptism became, in the minds of the Franks and of their enemies, the ritual of submission to vassalage and dependency. For a Saxon warrior chieftain, to submit to baptism was to bow in submission to the Frankish Caesar. The perennial wars between Romanitas and the Germanic tribes had become an explicit war of cultures and of religions. To lose a war was to lose one's traditional gods. The cruelty of the methods used on both sides only tended to escalate. Bonifacius was in perfect harmony not only with the See of Rome, but also with the Frankish kings. In a symbolic and ritual sense, the Pippinids, by putting aside the last Merovingian king, had received their kingship from the hands of the Pope. They worked closely with Bonifacius in Francia as well as in Germania. In 742 and 744, the councils of the Frankish Church were revived, which coincided with the great springtime gathering of the Frankish host in May. These events, part ecclesiastical, part military, became the annual assembly of the realm, where important business was decided. For the moment, the interest of the crown and the papacy were in close alignment. In the 620s and 630s, King Dagobertus of the Franks had sent Saint Amandus into Frisia and then to the Basques, with the mission to convert them to Christianity. When the Basques expelled him and revolted, this occasioned the sending in of a large Frankish army to subdue them. The alignment of foreign religious proselytism with the spears of the king fell quickly into place. In 719, Charles Martel invaded Frisia in force and conquered it. He then set up the Anglian, or English, missionary St. Willibrord as bishop of the newly founded settlement of Utrecht. He and his monks, Bonifacius was among them, could then proselytize and build churches in safety, protected by their socii, the Frankish military escort which accompanied them. Affronts to the saintly man would incur the violent wrath of the soldiers, whom Willibrord would try to restrain. Today, the descendants of these pagans celebrate Saint Willibrord's Day with a dancing procession through the streets of Echternach in Luxembourg. The model was set in place. The Frankish realm was in full expansion, especially to the east. That demand for religious consensus and uniformity rose to full force during the long and extraordinary reign of the Frankish king Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, later known as Charlemagne, 768 to 813. He was great even in stature. They dug up his skeleton, and in an age of chronic malnutrition and stunted growth, it measured 1.93 meters. He had a huge appetite for meat, as for his many wives and concubines, and was a deeply religious man. He spoke his own Dutch-like Frankish dialect and Latin, and is credited with understanding but not reading Greek. He failed to learn to write. At dinner in the Villa Palatium of Aquisgrana, Aachen or Aix-la-Chapelle, he would have the Latin text of St. Augustine's Civitas Dei, City of God, read aloud to accompany the meal. We will not recount here all his wars, save to sketch the broad features and significance of his kingship. For he was the model of Christian kingship for the next 1,000 years. In 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte consciously imitated him in the smallest detail when he crowned himself Emperor of the French and of Europe. The ceremonial and aura of royalty, which we can still see in Europe today, with its chamberlains, its seneschals, marshals, constables, etc., the king's orb and sceptre, the royal cloak, the crown and throne, all these were inherited by Charlemagne from his Merovingian and their Imperial Roman predecessors, and clinched in a form which was to be imitated by kings all through the Middle Ages and long thereafter. The key to his authority was his military charisma. He acted every inch the king. Every spring he summoned the Frankish aristocratic class, with their warriors, to a field of his choosing, the Champ de Mai, it's called in French, where the great council of the Frankish realm met, gathered around the synod of the bishops before setting out on the campaign for that summer. There was hardly a year in his nearly half-century reign when the host was not led by him personally to war, and he was routinely victorious. Victory brought prestige, and it imposed obedience on the otherwise centrifugal provincial magnates. In 778 he came to Bavaria and accused its duke Tassilo before the assembly of having deserted the campaign of his father Pepinus in Aquitania many years before. He was accused of the crime of Harislitz and condemned to death, a sentence later commuted to entering a monastery, the one of Umayyad, for life, and of formally renouncing his Arnulfing family's right to the Duchy of Bavaria. Tassilo had tried to resist his overlord's pressure by forming alliances with the nomadic Avars in the Hungarian plain to his east and with the Lombards across the Alps in Italy. The Lombards had been unable to renounce their claims to the duchies of Spoleto and Benevento, as to Ravenna and Rome. They invaded Roman territory again, and in 773, at the request of Pope Adrianus I, Charlemagne led the host across the Alps and laid siege to the Lombard capital, Pavia, for several months. So confident was he that during the siege he broke off and travelled to Rome for the first time. The sight of the Eternal City must have made a major impression on him. Rome was still, despite its much shrunken size, by far the largest and most important city in the Occident. The stupendous buildings of Constantine's city, the baths, temples, the fora, arenas, etc., were mostly still standing, though the temples were by now dilapidated and not in use. It was also a city in full reconstruction. Pope Adrianus, enjoying a new security thanks to the Franks, was pouring the revenues of the papal estates into building new basilicas and endowing new monasteries. 50 had been recently constructed. It is recorded that Carolus was particularly impressed by the great complex of the Imperial fora called the Forum of Trajan. The marbled columned hall of the Basilica Ulpia and porticos still stood. The Romans called the area after their celebrated Frankish tourist as the Campo Caroleo. Another of the wonders of that age was St. Peter's Basilica on the Vatican Hill, built by Constantine in 329. This church stood for the whole Middle Ages before being gradually demolished, as the St. Peter's we see today rose around it in the course of the 1500s. On arriving outside that church, Charlemagne mounted each step on his knees to the atrium forecourt, stooping to kiss each step. It was a reverence which had made Rome the primary pilgrimage destination of the Occident, as is shown by the numbers of Anglo-Saxon and other coins from the peripheries of Latin Christendom which have been found there. Rome was a cosmopolitan city once more, and was fast becoming the religious focus of the Western Christian peoples. The Lombard capital, Pavia, fell to the Franks in the summer of 774, and Carolus was not content simply to return to the north as his father had. He imposed a Frankish garrison on Pavia and had himself crowned with the iron crown of the Lombards, uniting that kingdom with the other Frankish realms. Later he would have his own son Pepinus reside in Italy and command the Lombard Frankish forces there. By taking that title of King of the Lombards, Charlemagne had created a political spine running from his Austrasian homeland near the Low Countries with northern and central Italy, a political axis that would endure through the entire Middle Ages. As he rode north from Italy to his homeland in Austrasia, Carolus took with him the image of what he had seen in the lands of the warm south, the remaining structures of Roman Italy, which spoke so eloquently of the might and the grandeur of a great civilization. Ringing in his ears also, he took the dignified and rarefied atmosphere of Rome's religious chant, so heavily influenced by the styles of Syria and Constantinople. And it is clear from the program of cultural revival that he purposefully undertook that he understood that such a civilization could not be built upon the foundation of military power alone, but that it required a deeply rooted and widely ramified educational and cultural superstructure. He returned also to his arduous life as the military leader of his followers, as their king. In spring each year, he gathered his host at the appointed date in the appointed place, and rode out to secure with them the frontiers of Christendom. In 777, at a synod he presided over at Paderborn, a field camp in Saxonia, emirs from northern pro-Abbasid cities in Islamic Spain came to ask him for an alliance to protect their own ambitions and to throw off the rule of the Umayyad Caliph at Cordoba. An embassy arrived also, after a long journey of over a year, sent by the great Caliph at Baghdad, Harun al-Rashid, presenting to Charlemagne rich silks, a water clock, and, wondrously, an elephant. The aim of these embassies was to counter the power of the Umayyad emir of Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman. The following campaigning season, Carolus crossed the Pyrenees from Aquitaine, while Austrasians, Lombards, and Burgundians came in from Septimania to meet at Zaragoza. The siege of that city proved difficult, and he broke it off to return home. At the pass of Roncesvalles, in the Pyrenees, Basques ambushed and annihilated his rearguard. From Italy, Carolus conquered Corsica and Sardinia, back from the Saracens. In 799, the Balearic Islands were also recovered. Between 785 and 795, his son Ludovicus, or Ludwig, Count of Aquitaine, led the Frankish forces into Iberia to retake from the Muslims the cities of Gerona, Urgell, and Cardona. In 797, he took Barcelona. By 811, Tarragona and Tortosa were back in Christian hands, and the Franks were established at the mouth of the Ebro. This allowed the setting up of the March of Spain. A march was a frontier district entrusted to a dux, a leader or duke in English, who had full military and civil authority to take whatever measures were necessary to secure the frontier. A march was usually fronted by a depopulated wasteland between the two enemies. In 788, the Avars invaded Friuli and Bavaria. Charlemagne led a punitive expedition down the Danube in 790. Through the decade, Dux Eric of Friuli waged systematic war against the Avars, destroying their ring forts. In 799, the Avar chiefs came to Aquisgrana to submit and to be baptized. A similar brush with the Danes, the future Vikings, resulted in a treaty of pacification in 808. On all sides, it seemed the Franks were invincible. The difficulty, however, lay across the Rhine. The process already described of missionary outposts leading to local hostility and a small massacre, followed by a major invasion by the Franks, was repeated on a grand scale. This was the 30-year struggle to subjugate the pagan tribes of Saxonia. It was a determined, difficult, and bloody affair. The resolution of this issue in Charlemagne's favour was to prove to be absolutely crucial for the future survival and prosperity of the Latin West. Year after year, Carolus led the Frankish host into Saxonia, won victory after victory, supervised mass baptisms, built fortresses and monasteries, and left garrisons and monks, and still the Saxons revolted at the first opportunity. The defeat, while he was recrossing the Pyrenees in 778, triggered another and more violent upheaval of the Saxons. In his wrath, Carolus came again with his army into Saxonia and crushed the pagan tribes in battle. At Verden, near modern Bremen, in 782, he gave 4,500 of them the choice of the line for baptism or that for the beheading block. A large portion are said to have chosen the latter. There is no doubt that Saxonia was won for Christendom by the sword and not by voluntary conversion, as had been the case in Ireland and Britain, for example. The subjugation and forced conversion of Saxony brought Romano-Christendom decisively across the Rhine and deep into central Germania, into a region where the Roman Empire had failed to find the will or the strength to penetrate. The Franks brought Latin Christendom up to the west bank of the river Elbe and to the Jutland Peninsula. This was made by Charlemagne into the Dana Mark, or the March of the Danes, giving its name to modern Denmark. 2 centuries later, the Elbe would be the jumping-off point for the conquest and Christianization of continental Europe as far as the Baltic regions, completed only in the 1300s. We should take stock of what the reigns of Charlemagne and that of his son Ludovicus Pius, Louis the Pious, did for the Occident over that precious period of power lasting 72 years. We have seen that during the previous period, as a result of the huge impact of the Islamic invasions, as well as due to the internal struggles within Francia, there had been an all-round slippage of cultural and educational standards across what remained of the Christian Mediterranean world. The triumph of the Pepinids, culminating in the reigns of Charlemagne and Ludovicus Pius, brought an end to the fragmentation and civil strife of the previous period. It brought peace and order and a common governance. The civilization of the Occident, so battered by the loss of Africa and Spain, by its internal political chaos, had 3/4 of a century to breathe and to recover. It gave time and it gave a governing hand to repair the cultural infrastructure of the continent. Perhaps without this period of reconstruction, it would never have been able to recover. Charlemagne purposefully undertook the reform of the dominions he ruled over. On a basic level, he saw to it that regulations existed for the economic support of the host, the gathering of the counts and their retinues. A specified portion of land, and those who owned and worked it, were responsible for the provision of an armoured cavalry warrior, a chain-mailed and helmeted mounted man, a loricatus. The land was measured out, including that in the newly conquered regions like Saxony, into standardized mansi, or manses, which was a set number of acres to support a peasant family with their own plot and animals to sustain themselves, and more to produce the surplus needed to support the loricatus. Also crucial for the lives of local people was the initiative to bring Christianity down to the villages. In Merovingian times, Christianity had been seen as a matter for the elite and for those living in the cities. The rustici were ignored, although pagan rituals in the countryside were periodically repressed. The monasteries and the landed nobility were encouraged to fund and operate simple local churches and to provide the services of a priest to perform the ritual of the Roman rite for the peasantry. In this way, and at this time, the Christianization of Europe in depth was first undertaken. The European system of local parishes, the most central and vital infrastructure for ordinary people down the centuries, began to be put in place under Charlemagne and Ludovicus. After Charlemagne's first visit to Rome in 773, he made the decision that the Roman rite, the Roman calendar for Easter, and the Roman choral style should uniformly replace all the diverse practices that had existed across the non-Islamic Occident. This is the origin of the misnamed Gregorian chant, as it is of the adoption of the epochal system of dating from the Annunciation of the Virgin, the Incarnation, calculated by the Eastern monk Dionysius Exiguus at Rome in the 520s, giving us the Western world's dating system of Anno Domini. These two reigns saw a massive foundational and building program of monasteries all across the lands of Western Christendom, and their regulation was standardized. The Capitulare Monasticum was promulgated in 817, whose 87 ordinances were sent to all the 650 monasteries of the empire. Most importantly, the cultural productivity of the society, embodied in its monasteries and the palaces and cathedral schola, was reformed and given fresh impetus. The copying of manuscripts was routinized and put on a systematic footing. A new, clear and efficient unical handwriting script facilitated this work as it did the reading of its output. The idea of a curriculum of studies was revived and propagated, consisting of the subjects of the trivium for basic skills, whence we get our word trivial, and the quadrivium for higher studies, which were to remain the structure of European education well into the 1600s. This was truly the foundation of the European educational system, to which we owe everything. It was from this time on that those Latin classical authors who have come down to us directly had their texts transcribed from rotting papyrus to long-lasting parchment. On the economic level, Charlemagne continued the work commenced by his predecessor Columbanus. He confirmed the standardized weights and the ratios between the coin denominations and set down their names: libra, solidus, denarius. This remained the monetary system throughout the Middle Ages and on through the Ancien Régime, only being abolished by the currency reforms of the French Revolution, which introduced a decimal ratio and was spread by Napoleon. I am old enough to have had to learn the ratios and names LSD instituted by Charlemagne before they were abolished in Britain and Ireland in 1971. He also issued a single currency, so to speak, by exercising his right of sovereignty by having the standard coin issued throughout Francia, Italy, and his other domains, with his head in profile as the Roman Emperor. This differed strikingly in design compared to the high prestige and always previously imitated Constantinopolitan coinage, with the emperor face-on, accompanied by his wife and wearing a crown and a long beard. Charlemagne chose to revert to the old pagan style of several centuries previously. There is one more crucial institution that we must take the time to account for. In 799, the then Pope Leo III, a man of humble origins, was set upon in the streets of Rome by his opponents, and they attempted to inflict upon him the politically disabling mutilation that was then practiced at Constantinople, to put out his eyes and cut his tongue. Pope Leo apparently struggled free and fled from Rome. Legend has it that his enemies were successful and that these organs miraculously grew back. This incident illustrates the intensity and sometimes the violence of the struggles which have been going on in many episcopal cities for centuries already. A bishop's mitre was a matter of major importance to the great families of the province or city, and it was an affront that another family should wear it. The bishopric of Rome was and remained no exception. Leo did not go to Constantinople to seek refuge and help, as his predecessors would have. He went all the way to Paderborn in Saxony, where Charlemagne was holding court in his newly founded wooden city, then under construction. There was a committee of investigation of the vague crimes of gross immorality that the Pope was accused of, which produced a useless report. The great king, as rector of the Christian Church, as he understood his role, then travelled down to Rome to sort the matter out. On Christmas Day, in the great Basilica of St. Peter's, as Carolus was kneeling during the ritual, the Pope approached him with an imperial diadem in his hands and placed it on Carolus's head. He then stepped back and performed the homage due to a Roman emperor, prostrating himself full length 3 times before him on the ground. The assembled nobility and clergy, the populace or people, acclaimed him with the shout as Augustus and Imperator. When he returned to Aquisgrana, Carolus took a series of measures to accord with his new status as emperor. He gathered all his fideles, his faithful followers, and had them swear an oath of loyalty to him using his new titles. His chancery adopted the Constantinopolitan style of using a gold seal on his documents, as well as using the Greek indication system of dating. He stopped signing his own documents and copied the Constantinopolitan one of having his secretaries sign in red ink on his behalf. It was then that he issued the new imperial coinage with his own image on it. All his documents thenceforth, until the year of his death, bore the style Carolus Serenissimus Augustus ad Deo coronatus Magnus Pacificus Imperator Romanum gubernans imperium qui et per misericordiam Dei Rex Francorum et Langobardorum. Charles, most serene Augustus, by God crowned, great Pacific Emperor, governing the Roman Empire, who, by the mercy of God, is King of the Franks and the Lombards. Several years before, the popes in Rome had ceased using the imperial image on their coins, and had begun dating their documents by the reign of the King of the Franks and of the current Pope. The West had not only turned its back on the real Roman Emperor in 756, in 800 it had set up its own emperor in the far north, who was conceived of as operating a temporal, spiritual condominium with the Bishop of Rome. Everybody in the world knew that there was only one Roman Empire and one Roman Emperor, the one in Constantinople. At that moment there was a temporary anomaly, in that the emperor there was a woman, Irene. The crowning of another emperor in the West could only imply an aspiration to rule over all the Christian world. It was an implication that neither Charlemagne nor his successor chose to do anything about. But the claim remained, explicitly stated by Charlemagne and intensified by his son and successor, Ludovicus, whose own circle wrote about a translatio imperii, a transferal of empire, and whose coinage proclaimed a restauratio imperii, a restoration of the Roman Empire. During the second half of the 700s, the Occident had set out on its own path, deserting the Roman political tradition in place since the days of Constantine. By the end of the century, it had consolidated itself and was developing new institutions, and it had an emperor of its own, in alliance with the Patriarch of Rome, who had for centuries claimed and had partly been acknowledged as the prime religious authority over all other bishoprics. The form and content of Latin Christendom had come to life. The panegyrist at court, who praised Charlemagne as Europe veneranda farus, imperator et princeps populi Christiani, venerated beacon of Europe, emperor and prince of the Christian people, could not be aware of the long-term historical truth of his evocation. The clash between the West and the Empire was delayed by events, by the force of tradition and by the residual fellow feeling that existed. But it would one day come. In the meantime, the glowing future that appeared to await the revivified and united Occident, as King Ludovicus Pius ruled competently between 814 and 840, turned to dust within a decade or two of his death. Europe was about to be assailed from all sides by a new age of pagan and barbarian, as well as Islamic, invasions. It was entering into the dark valley of a century of cruel troubles. The work of Charlemagne would now be put to the test. Would Western civilization, for that's what it now was, survive?